Dubbing is Prep A. Alexander the Great.
Chapter 1. The Greek Word. On his black war horse Bucephalus, Alexander, king of Macedonia, rode at the head of his army. Unlike most of his soldiers, he had no beard. His skin was fair, and his light-colored, wavy hair grew long and low on his neck. He was in India and proud of the past few years. Finally, he had proved that he was the greatest general in history, and he now ruled the greatest empire that the world had ever seen. His soldiers had joined him from many parts of the world. There were Thracians, Macedonians, and Greeks from southeastern Europe, Scythians, Bactrians, and Sogdians from Central Asia, and Indians, riding their enormous armed war elephants. It seemed that no one could stop the march of this extraordinary army. Certainly not the Persians, who had once ruled much of Asia, but were now completely defeated by Alexander the Great. 2 centuries earlier, the Persians' enemy in Europe was Greece, not Macedonia. In those days and during Alexander's lifetime, Greece was not a country. It was a collection of independent states which shared a language, a religion, and a way of life. Athens and Sparta were 2 of the most famous states, but there were almost 1,500 others.
Women could not vote, but the ordinary men of these Greek democracies had real power. Religion was an important part of Greek life. There were many Greek gods. Zeus was the king of the gods, and he used thunder and lightning to punish the people, and earth sent messages to them. He had many children, and they too were gods. His son Dionysus was god of the forces of nature. His daughter Athene was connected with learning, and there were many more. All over the Greek world, people used to visit special places to ask the gods for advice. They asked whether they should start a new business or choose a wife. As to officials, they asked whether they should build a new temple or go to war. Communicating through religious officials, the gods gave them complicated answers that could often be understood different ways. In the 6th century BC, for example, the Athenians sent officials to the Greeks' most important religious center, Delphi. They asked the god Apollo how they should protect themselves from attack by the Persians, and were told that they would be from the Persians behind a wall of wood. After much discussion, the Athenians decided that the wall of wood meant ships. They built their ships and learned to sail them. A few years later, they defeated the Persians at sea. The Greeks believed that the greatest heroes, like Hercules, went to live with the gods when they died. Ordinary people went to a dark place below the earth called the underworld. Each Greek state was under the protection of one or more of the gods. Each of these gods usually had a temple built in a style that has been copied in the Western world for almost 2,500 years.
The Macedonians spoke a strange form of Greek that other Greek speakers had difficulty understanding. Macedonian noblemen liked horse riding, hunting, eating meat and drinking wine. They did not share other Greeks' interest in literature, science and philosophy. Macedonia was ruled by a royal family that believed they were relatives of the Greek god Zeus. The king lived in Pella, Macedonia's capital city. The palace was as beautiful as the finest buildings in Greece, and the Macedonian kings wanted their country to be more Greek. They welcomed several important Greeks there, including many who were escaping the wars. The writer Pindar and the doctor Hippocrates were guests of the Macedonian kings, and Euripides wrote one of his greatest plays in Pella. And then in 359 BC, Alexander's father Philip became king, and Macedonia's relationship with the rest of Greece changed forever. Chapter 2. A Macedonian Prince. Although Alexander's achievements were extraordinary, in many ways his father, King Philip, was responsible for his success. When Philip became king on Macedonia, he drew all his energy into increasing his power. He conquered the lands east of Macedonia, which were rich in gold. With this gold, he was able to pay for a full-time, professional army, which gave him a great advantage over the part-time armies of the Greek states to his south. It was a well-trained, well-organized army, and soon it had defeated all Macedonia's neighbors. When he died, Philip's empire covered most of modern-day Macedonia, Greece, Albania, Bulgaria, and European Turkey. In Macedonia, men were allowed to have more than one wife at the same time. Philip had 6 wives. His first wife, his queen and the mother of Alexander, was called Olympias. Olympias was a princess from the neighboring state of Epirus. She has a strong character and a quick temper. If she had a serious
As Philip became richer and more powerful, he hired philosophers, artists, musicians, and engineers from all over the Greek world. His court at Pella was an exciting place for a young prince to grow up. Alexander could talk to people who had lived in Egypt and made friends with a man who had been a governor in the Persian Empire. Macedonia was now well connected in the wide world. Philip was too busy leading his army to spend much time with his son.
But he made sure that Alexander's teacher during his teenage years would be the best that money could buy. When Alexander was 13, his father hired Aristotle, a student of the great philosopher Plato. At that time, Aristotle was an unknown teacher with thin legs and small eyes. He also had one of the sharpest and most questioning minds in history. Aristotle later wrote many important works of philosophy. He was one of the first people to use scientific methods to learn more about plants and animals. He studied the stars and the way that the sea shapes the land. He wrote about politics and literature. The list of his interests and achievements is extraordinary. Nobody knows how much he taught Alexander. Aristotle later wrote that it was a waste of time teaching political science to a young man because he has no experience of life and still follow his emotion. Was he describing his people, Alexander, here? Perhaps, but as Alexander grew up like his teacher, he never stopped asking questions. Whenever Pella had visitors from other parts of the world, Alexander learned as much as he could from them. Alexander, like Aristotle, had a hunger for knowledge. Alexander was not Aristotle's only pupil in Macedonia.
Alexander grew up quickly into a responsible and intelligent young man. When he was 16, he was allowed to take charge of the government while Philip was away with the army. Soon after this, a tribe to the east of Macedonia started to cause trouble, and Alexander himself a small army to defend it. Then, when he was 18, he commanded part of his father's great army at the Battle of Cornea. In this battle, the Macedonians finally defeated the great steeds start and forced them to accept Philip as their leader. Philip started to make plans to free the great steeds in Asia from Persian rule. Alexander felt that he would have an important part to play in his father's war against Persia. The future looked good, but then his father fell in love. Eurydice was the daughter of Macedonian Norman. She was young and very beautiful. Soon, Philip was planning their wedding. Olympias was very angry because she was Philip's new wife. Eurydice would be more powerful than she was. And if Eurydice had a son, he could be cautioned as kind instead of Alexander. At the wedding, there was a big argument. Alexander attacked his father, although no one was hurt. Alexander and his mother left the court immediately. Alexander soon repented, but his father went to live in their home country, Asia. appears. Without his mother, Alexander was very nervous about his portion at court. Then he heard news that made him ever more worried. In preparation for his war on Persia, Philip was in concord with his kind of career on the west edge of the Persian Empire, and the two rulers want the arrange of a family marriage. As well as Alexander, Philip had another son, Alexander's half-brother. He had learning difficulties and could never be given adults.
Alexander could not understand why his father wanted this royal marriage for Herodes and not for him. He sent friends to the Carian court to say that he would make a much better husband than his half-brother. The Carian king was pleased at first, but Philip was very angry when he heard what Alexander had done. He did not want to visit Alexander on a small country like Caria. Alexander's friends were sent away from Macedonia, and soon the Carian king got worried and lost interest in a marriage with anyone in Philip's family. Alexander had ruined everything. His position at court became even weaker than before, as Philip sent part of his army into Asia to start the war against Persia. He planned another wedding. Cleopatra, Alexander's sister, was marrying her uncle, the king of Epirus. All the local rulers in Philip's empire were there, but Olympias, who was Cleopatra's mother as well as the king of Epirus' sister, was not at the wedding, since he was joining the royal families of Epirus and Macedonia with this new marriage. Philip did not need Olympias and her Epirus connections. After the wedding, Philip was walking to the celebration with Alexander and his daughter's new husband. His endless battles and left him with one eye and a bad leg. But the
situation was more difficult abroad, when news of Philip's murder spread around his empire. The Pharaohs in the north and the city-states in the south decided to free themselves from Macedonian rule within a few months of his father's death. Alexander had to fight to keep the empire together. He first went to the great states of Sicily. The usual route was along a narrow valley into mountains, but this was now guarded by the Thessalians. Alexander decided that it was too dangerous to take the Macedonian soldiers and war horses this way. Instead, he created a new path. He ordered the soldiers to cut steps in the steppe rock face of mountain on the border between Macedonia and Thessaly. After weeks of hard work, his army entered Thessaly by the new route, took the Thessalians by surprise and defeated them easily. The Thessalians welcomed Alexander as their new leader. A march at lightning speed then took Alexander's army on a tour of Greek city-states. One by one, they realized that battle would end in disaster, so they quickly made peace with him instead. Only Sparta refused to escape. Alexander, as their leader, sending the message, it is our father's habit not to follow others, but to lead them. Alexander was not too worried. The rest of the Greeks hate Sparta more than they hate Macedonia. He could manage without Spartan help. There were also,
while Alexander's second in command, General Parmen, led the main army into Asia by the shortest sea crossing. Alexander himself decided to see some sights. His destination was the ruined city of Troy, scene of the legendary Trojan War, where Greeks and Asians had fought for the first time. The Greeks believed that the war had started 1,000 years before the time of Alexander, when Paris, a Trojan prince, stole the beautiful Helen from her Greek husband Menelaus. Of all the heroes of the Trojan War, the greatest was Achilles. When he was a baby, his emotional mother had held his hair and covered the rest of his body in the water of the legendary river Styx. After this, he could only be heard on his heel. Achilles grew up handsome and brave at the start of Trojan War. His mother gave him a choice. He could stay at home, live a normal life and die an old man, or he could go to Troy, die young and be famous forever. Of course, Achilles chose Troy. He was the fastest runner and the strongest fighter in the Greek army. But he also had a quick temper. After an argument about a female prisoner, which
People talk of Alexander Greeks defeating the Persian, but there were 15,000 Greeks in the Persian army and only 7,000 in Alexander's. In Greece, it was difficult to earn a living if you did not own land. They were plenty of slaves, so landowners and businessmen really wanted to employ paid workers. The shipping business was a possibility, but storms at sea were common and fortunes were lost as often as they were made. For many, the most attractive choice was a life in the highly paid Persian army. The army was full of failed Greek farmers and businessmen, younger sons who owned no land, and politicians who were not welcome in the city of their birth. A Greek general called Memnon had been responsible for the Macedonians' most recent defeats. He had grown up on the island of Rhodes, spent some time living in Macedon, and come to Asia 15 years before Alexander. His wife Barsin was Persian, and he now owned a large farm, a present from the Persian king for his loyal service. Memnon now had a plan to defeat Alexander. The Persians should not face the Macedons in battle, he advised. Instead, they should burn their own farms and make sure Alexander's army could get no food. If Alexander did not win a battle, the Greek cities would not help him. Soon his hungry soldiers would have to return to Europe. The rest of the Persian commanders disagreed with Memnon. Instead, they decided to defend their country in battle. The Persian army grouped on the east bank of the river Granicus. When Alexander heard the news, he realized his luck and ordered his soldiers to march there as quickly as possible. Some of Alexander's advisors warned him that for religious reasons it was not a good month for a battle. Alexander acted typically. He created a new month. Alexander and his army reached the Granicus in late afternoon.
The Persians had chosen their position well. The river was 20 meters wide and ran fast between steep, muddy banks. If Alexander ordered his army to cross the river, it would be easy for the Persians to cut them down in the mud. Alexander had read in the work of a Greek historian that the Persians liked to camp some distance from their chosen battleground and didn't march before the sun came up. The Macedonians crossed the river in the early hours of the morning and found it undefended. They now had the advantage of surprise. Alexander led his horsemen against the enemy. The Persian horsemen fought back, but they were badly organized because of the surprise attack. When Alexander's spear broke during the fighting, a Persian commander saw his opportunity and struck Alexander on the head. But Alexander wasn't hurt, and before the Persian could strike again, a Macedonian called Cleides came to protect his king. Cleides' sister had been Alexander's nurse as a baby, and now Cleides saved his life. As the fighting continued, the Persians failed to organize a strong defense. Many of their commanders were killed, several by Alexander himself. Soon the Persians on horseback were retreating. As the Macedonians surrounded the Persian camp,
About 17,000 hired Greek foot soldiers tried to defend it. They managed to hurt Alexander's horse, but there were many more Macedonian attackers. They couldn't hope to win. 2,000 were taken prisoner and later sent to Macedonia as slaves. The rest were killed. Alexander used this cruel treatment as a message to other Greeks. Leave the Persian army and stop fighting your own countrymen. If you don't, your suffering will be worse than the Persians. After his success at the Granicus, the Greek cities in Asia quickly opened their gates to Alexander's. He sent messengers to all the cities that he had already passed, telling them to become democracies, to create their own. As Queen Ada's adopted son, Alexander became king of Caria. Preparations now had to be made for the winter.
Preparation now had to be made for the winter. Alexander decided to send home to Macedonia all the soldiers who had married just before the start of the war. This was a popular decision. Alexander's army now loved their leader more than ever. Alexander left his mother, Queen Ada, in charge of Caria. With the rest of the army, he marched to Gordium in Central Turkey and waited there for the return of the newly married soldiers. During the winter, Alexander became interested in a local legend. In the palace at Gordium, which had in the past been the home of the kings of Phrygia, there was an old chariot. It was tied to piers of wood by a complicated knot that no one had ever managed to untie. According to legend, Asia would one day be ruled by the person who could untie the knot. Alexander decided that he would untie the knot. In front of all his soldiers, he moved towards the chariot. After some minutes, the knot was broken. But there were two different stories from the people who were watching. Some said that they saw him use his knife to cut it. We will never know. But that night, the gods seemed to send a thing of their sports. 100 and lighting filled the sky was spread among his soldiers and the local people. Alexander, who had untied the Gordian knot, was the future ruler of all Asia. Chapter 5. Face to face with Darius. While Alexander was at Gordium, the Persians started to make more plans to defeat him. The Macedonians had no warship. The Persians had 300. It was time for the Persians to take advantage of their power at sea. Led by General Memnon, they took back.
Persia itself wasn't present there, around, but the great king controlled all the lands from Egypt to Pakistan and from Uzbekistan to the Arabian Sea. His riches were legendary, and he received the treatment of a god. He was protected by a bodyguard of 10,000 soldiers. They were called the immortals because when one man died or became ill, his position was immediately filled by another man. The great king gave land to the man that served him well. The land-owning Persians had a very comfortable way of life that was often a subject of wonder among the Greeks. They had soft carpets on their floors and beautiful gardens full of flowers. They ate the finest food, and hundreds of servants looked after all their needs. But with one word, the all-powerful king could take away their good fortune forever. Wide, well-built roads connected the great king's most important cities, Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, with the far corners of his empire. The best of these roads was the royal road, which led 2,300 kilometers from Susa in the heart of the empire to Sardis on the Mediterranean.
Chapter 5. Although they were difficult to defeat on flat ground, the Macedonians were having problems on the steep riverbanks. They were close to defeat at the hands of the hired Greek soldiers who fought for the Persians. But just in time, Alexander's horsemen broke through the Persian line and came to help the foot soldiers. Soon the Macedonians were winning the battle. King Darius was watching the fighting from his chariot. As Alexander and his Macedonian horsemen moved towards him from two sides, the eyes of the two kings met for a moment. Then Darius, realizing that the battle was lost, turned his chariot and quickly retreated. Chapter 6. Darius escaped over the mountains on horseback, leaving Scythia in his chariot. But the battle of Issus was a serious defeat for the Persians. Enormous numbers of Persians died. The rest of the Persian army broke into small groups, and most of the hired Greeks sailed home in Persian warships. King Darius lost much more than his soldiers and ships. The Macedonians found extraordinary riches left near the battlefield, and even more at the city of Damascus. There were 220 kilograms of silver and as many gold coins as Alexander's father, King Philip, had received in tax from his empire in a whole year. There were piles of cups, bowls, and boxes made of gold. Alexander liked one gold box so much that he decided to keep his favorite copy of the Iliad in it. There were thousands of servants, including 329 female musicians, 300 19 cooks, and 70 wine waiters who had come to look after the great king while he commanded the army. And most important of all, the Macedonians took prisoner Darius's wife, mother, and children.
Alexander made sure that the Persian royal family received royal treatment. They were given fine clothes and jewelry to wear and had a comfortable place to live. Soon Darius wrote to Alexander asking for his family's return. But Alexander replied that the royal family would only be freed if Darius called him King Alexander of Asia. If you think you have a right to your empire, stand and fight for it, wrote Alexander. Do not run away, because I will come after you wherever you go. Another prisoner was the dead General Memnun's beautiful Persian wife Basin. She had lived for a short time in Macedonia when her father, a Persian governor, had become unpopular with the Persian king. In Macedonia, Basin had known Alexander as a boy. Now he was a man, and she was his prisoner. Alexander fell in love with her, and they were close for the next 5 years. Alexander now needed to take the ports in Phoenicia, present-day Lebanon. Most of them were happy to welcome the Macedonians and say goodbye to Persian rule. But the city of Tyre was different. Tyre stood on an island about a kilometer out to sea and was ringed by a wall 50 meters high. Few cities were as difficult to attack, but Alexander as usual wasted no time in worrying about the difficulty of his job. He told his engineers to build a wide road across the sea to the island of Tyre, using stone from castle ruins to fill in the sea. The first part of this road was built quickly, but the last 200 meters cost many lives. The Tyrants shot arrows at the Macedonians as they worked, but the Macedonians used stone-throwing machines to clear the archers from their shooting positions. The machines were also used to make holes in the city walls, but
for centuries, Egypt had been one of the most powerful countries in the Middle East, but in 525 BC it had fallen under Persian rule. Its people had never fully accepted this situation and had regularly fought for their independences. Now they welcomed Alexander as their new ruler. They were deeply religious, and they said that Alexander had a better estate than the Persian kings to the Egyptian gods. They gladly made him their pharaoh. As pharaoh, he was believed to be a living god, son of the Egyptian creator god Amun. After spending time in Egypt's capital city Memphis, Alexander traveled north to the mouth of the river Nile. There he organized the building of a new city, Alexandria. It was not the only city of that name. One had already been built near Usus, and before he died, Alexander built more than 20 others. But this Alexandria was perhaps his greatest gift to the future. In the centuries
that followed, it became one of the Mediterranean world's most important centers of learning and of political and economic power. Leaving most of his army in Alexandria, Alexander traveled 200 kilometers west along the Mediterranean coast with a small group of soldiers. He came to the Greek city of Parthenion, then turned south into the Libyan desert. This time his destination was not an enemy city, it was Siva, home of the Libyan god Ammon. Siva in Libya was known all over the Greek world as a place where people could ask Ammon for advice and receive an honest answer. The answers were communicated to visitors by Ammon's religious officials. Ammon was connected with the Egyptian god Ammon and the Greek god Zeus. It seems that Alexander had an important question to ask the god, but
by burning the Euphrates Valley, the Persians forced Alexander to take the only other possible road east. This brought him to Darius' coach of battle-flight. Gegona in present-day Iraq, Darius made sure that, unlike at Issus, the battle-flight was wide enough for him to take advantage of his enormous army. Although Alexander had been joined by new soldiers from Macedonia, Greece, and ocean Mediterranean coast, this only took the place of the men who had died. Against Alexander's 7,000 horsemen and 40,000 foot soldiers, Darius had 30,000 horsemen and 200 foot soldiers to send into battle. At first, Alexander planned to take Paris by surprise in the early morning. But when it became clear that Darius was expecting them, the Macedonians took time to look carefully at the battle-flight. In the center of the fight, they saw that spears had been stuck in the ground to hurt, and horses that ran at the enemy lines. They saw elephants as flying sights for men who had never met such animals before, and for their horses. They also noticed the unwind ground had fallen to help the drivers of the famous Persian war crowds. Darius had 200 of their crowds with speakers pointing out in front of horses and log cleaners fixed to the walls. It was unlucky that the original Macedonian soldiers were feeling confident before the battle. The following morning, Alexander spoke to his men, and their confidence returned. He called the gods, "If I am the son of Zeus, you will defend us and help to make us strong."
Alexander was careful not to follow the Persian habit of insulting the Babylonian gods. He gave gift to the rich god when Marduk and paid for the rebuilding of temples which had been damaged under the Persian. He spent a few weeks relaxing in the Red Sea with his army. He probably found time to visit the famous Hanging Gardens, a park palm with trees and flowers on many different levels. Like the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus, his was one of the 7 wonders of the world. Alexander left Babylon to be ruled by its Persian governor, who had fought against the Macedonians at Gaugamela just a short time before. Many people were surprised at this, thinking that only Greek speakers should rule Alexander's new empire, but later there were other Persians-born governors. The next great city of Alexander's route was Susa. The climate there was so hot. It was said that at midday snake could not cross the route for fear of being burnt by the sun. But its people gave Alexander a warm welcome, and its riches made it an attractive destination. After sitting in the royal seat of God in Theseus' palace, Alexander took control of 1.5 million kilograms of gold. His financial difficulties at the start of the war were now just a memory. Then came Persepolis in the heart of Persia itself. It was natural to expect the Persians to defend their homeland. Alexander led a small group of horsemen and foot soldiers through the mountains to defend any Persian forces that were defending the mountain routes. The path was steep, narrow, and covered in snow. After 4 days' climb, the Macedonians came to the Persians' gates, a wall of rock in the mountain.
If Alexander left these Persians undefeated, they could attack his main army, led by his second-in-command Parmenion, on its way to Persepolis. There was only one hope of success, but it was very dangerous. With half his soldiers, Alexander followed a local guide along a small path used only by animals and their owners. At night, as the wind blew snow in their faces, they ran through the mountains. In the early morning, they rejoined the main path beyond the Persians' position and took the Persians by surprise, with Macedonians in front and behind them. The Persians suffered a terrible defeat. Only a few escaped died. Finally, in January 330 BC, Persepolis lay undefended. Alexander's soldiers moved through the city, destroying everything and everyone in their path in their search for riches. For many, the long journey from Europe was not well rewarded, as they found extraordinary quantities of gold and silver, saddlery and expensive clothes. But the greatest riches were saved for the Macedonian king. At Persepolis, Alexander found 3 million kilograms of royal Persian gold. It took 15,000 animals to move it under Alexander's orders to Susa. Alexander chose a new governor for Persepolis, a Persian nobleman whose father had been killed at the Dionysus. It seemed that Persepolis was going to receive similar treatment to Babylon and Susa. Then, after a celebratory meal, the Athenian girlfriend of Alexander's friend Ptolemy made a suggestion. Alexander should burn the place where they were eating. She said to punish the Persians for burning the Athenian Acropolis many years before. Alexander
The quote complains about Alexander's new Persian habits now grew more serious. A group of Macedonians planned to murder their king. Philotas, son of General Parmenion and commander of the Macedonian horsemen, was told about these plans but failed to warn Alexander. When the murder plans were eventually known, Philotas' early silence seemed strange. People began to wonder if the murder had been his idea. Philotas was found guilty and killed. We know that Philotas was a powerful commander who had openly criticized Alexander. We do not know if he was really responsible for the murder plans. No talk Alexander had real cause to worry because Philotas' father, General Parmenion, controlled half of the army at the time of his son's death. It was possible that Parmenion would turn against Alexander in anger at the treatment of his son. It was even possible that Parmenion himself had made the plans to murder Alexander. Alexander could not afford to wait and see what Parmenion would do. Instead, he organized the murder of this great general who had been such an important commander in the Macedonian army since the days of Alexander's father, King Philip. After this, Alexander was very careful. His soldiers' letters to their families were secretly opened. A special group of soldiers was formed of people who had criticized the king. In this way, the dangerous waves could not spread to other soldiers who were still loyal to Alexander. In future battles, these soldiers thought especially bravely to prove that they deserved to stay with the army and not be left behind. After these unpleasant events, the Macedonians marched again towards Bactria. The route took them straight over the Macedonian soldiers that were surrounded by an enemy siege. Alexander had to send an army to help them, but the citizens on the far side of the river Jectors seemed dangerous too. He decided to send only a small force to Marsanda and to use his main army to defeat the Scythians. His own battle against the Scythians was successful, and their leaders were soon asking for peace. But in Marsanda, the situation went from bad to worse. The Macedonians were met by enemy horsemen. Without Alexander to lead them, they fought badly, were forced onto a river island, and were killed. More than 2,000 men were lost. It was the first real defeat that Alexander's army had suffered. Alexander spent the summer of 328 BC trying to win back control of Sogdiana. Before he had fully succeeded, a terrible argument started over dinner one night. It was between Alexander and Cletus,
the man who had saved Alexander's life at the Battle of the Granics. It is possible that the argument was about Alexander's attitude to his older commanders and to his dead father Philip's memory. Since his visit to Sweden, Alexander believed that he was the son of the god Zeus. Perhaps Cletus thought that Alexander was forgetting the importance of his human father. Certainly, many insults were exchanged, and in the end, Alexander killed Cletus with a spear. In the morning, Alexander felt terrible about losing his temper so violently. He went to his tent and refused to come out for several days, but the murder could not be undone. After this, it seems likely that his relationship with his commanders was different. Cletus has been killed because he had criticized the king. Nobody else wanted to die for the same reason. The word salt started to go bitter after this. His Sogdians, led by Oxyar,
they climbed to a position above the Sogdians. When the Sogdians woke up and half the rock climbed, they thought for a moment that the Macedonian army really had grown wings. They immediately accepted the fight and were taken prisoner. Among the prisoners was Oxyarion's beautiful daughter Rexona. Alexander fell in love with her and soon they were married. Politicians think was a good idea too. Oxyarion was a powerful nobleman in Sogdian, and now he had a strong reason to stay loyal to Alexander. Others were less loyal. Alexander soon learned of another plan to murder him. Cletus, who was a pupil and close relative on Aristotle and was writing the history of Alexander's heroic adventure, was blamed for the plan and killed. Beyond Barcia lay India, very few Greeks had ever been there, but many strange stories were told of this mysterious land. People said that it was right in were told of his land. People said that it was right in gold, which was dug by enormous interest, and that Indian wool grew on trees. They said that people lived for 200 years. That tree was a terrible of one-footed man, and that to the east of India lay in the ocean, the edge of the world. Alexander led his army into India, more for the adventure than to build an empire. By now, the soldiers were mostly Asian, not European, Asian Greek, from
While Alexander archers shot at the Leibson drives heat-fought soldiers cut at their legs. The Leibsons went mad, picking men up and throwing them violently to ground. Then, fighting and tired, they walked slowly backwards. The battle had ended. For Alexander there was just one sad result of the battle. Pachapalas was hurt by Bruce soon after he had crossed the river. A few hours later he died. Alexander built a new city on the banks of the river and called it Bucaphal in memory of his much-loved horse. Alexander's army continued as thought the mood of the Punjab's rainy regions, when rivers broke their banks. The men had to escape the water in local hilltop lakes. The snakes of the area did the same, and many men died from the poisonous bites of snakes hiding in tents, clothes, and cooking pots. They reached the banks of the river Hypasis, and at this point a local king gave Alexander some unwelcome information. They were still a long way from an ocean ocean, which formed Greece's mid and the edge of the wars. To get there, they had to cross the river Ganges, more than 5 kilometers wide, and fight the powerful king of Madhada and his 14,000 elephants. Alexander was not especially worried by this news. He had defeated elephants before and destroyed an empire greater than Madhada's. He called his men together and told men about the adventures and achievements that the future held. But his men great his worst silence. Some of them had marched 18,000 kilometers since they had first arrived in Asia. They had not seen their families for 8 long years, and after 3 terrible months of rain, they were muddy wet tried. They did not want to cross the Hypasis and attack another great empire. They wanted the first person to defeat an Alexander's lives come from his own army. He realized that he had no choice. Many of these men bet theirs in their eyes as they heard the good news. Alexander was going to lead at home. In his tent, Alexander was not as happy as his men. His defeat had been very public and it hurt him greatly. There was a philosopher called Aristarchus who was traveling with the army. He tried to make Alexander feel better, but according to legend, Alexander cried when Aristarchus talked about the number of words bent stars. He explained his stars. There are so many words, and I have not yet conquered even one. Chapter 9. The last years. Alexander refused to go back the way that he had come. His thirst for adventure was satisfied a little when his men agreed instead to Buddhist boats. They planned to follow the Hydaspes and Indus rivers south to Arabian Sea. The journey started well, but it was difficult to sail so many boats and unfamiliar waters. When the river was too fast, the boats lost control and many crashed into each other and broke on one oceans. Alexander had to swim for his life. Alexander wanted to conquer all the tribes that he passed. The Malay who lived in the around the city of Multan, cause him to Mostrop. With a small force, Alexander surrounded Multan. Then he led an attack on the city walls. He climbed a ladder and jumped down inside the city, but the enemy managed to break the rest of the Macedonian ladders, and only 3 of these bodyguards were able to follow him. They fought bravely, but they were attacked on the 3 sides. Other Macedonians arrived as quickly as they could, limping and.
But when they reached their king, he had a mirror long, arrow deep in his chest. They defeated his attack, then killed him every on his shield, but they had little hope that he would live. The Malio were killed men, women and children, and the other tribe rushed to escape defeat peacefully, but Nes teached the main army on the reef that Alexander was dead, and finally arrived not only alive but able to ride and walk. Alexander must surely be protected by the gods. Alexander soldiers fought bloody battles against he Brahmins, which brought the total number of Indian dead in the last 6 months to 250,000. Then the rainy season began again, and there were terrible storms. When they finally reached the Arabian Sea, they gave thanks to the gods. They did not know that the most difficult part of their journey was still ahead of them. 200 years before, the Persian king Cyrus the Great had lost a whole army in the Gadrosian desert. The desert, now called Macron, covers 62,000 square kilometers of present-day southern Pakistan and Iran, and their road led across it. Alexander led a force by land carrying fire for the man who kills the ships, Alexander's friends. Nearchus was in charge of the ships, which brought food for the land army. It was impossible to pull enough food for everyone through the sand of the desert. The scholars and soldiers defeated each other, but the storm of the rainy season killed the ships other. Alexander's army had already entered the desert. Then the local people started fading, and the ships were unable to take on board all the food that they needed. In the desert, the sand was deep, and the soldiers' legs sank into it. It had been blown into steep mountains and valleys, so every kilometer felt like 10. Occasionally, they come to a watering place.
Their 13 men dived into the water and drank so grievously that they died. The expected rains come late, and when they did, they arrived very forcefully. Most of the women, children, and animals following the army were washed away and killed. The Gadrean desert was a hell on earth. Soon the men started to die of hunger. If they left the army in search of food, they were likely to be killed by poisonous plants or snakes. Then they discovered that their guides had lost their enemy. Eventually, 8 weeks after entering the desert, they come out on the other side. But the desert had proved a much stronger enemy than an army. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children had died on the march. At this time, nurses and the sheep were only just living idea. They too were hungry and thirsty on their journey, but nurses lent them well and they lost few men. Eventually, the sheep reached Germania and the far side of the desert, and Alexander was there to welcome them. There were wild celebrations. Sailors and soldiers were together again, and they knew that they were likely to be alive. When Alexander had marched over the Hindu coast, few Persians had believed that he would ever return. Since then, there had been stories had died in Malta or in the Gadrean desert. They were very surprised.
Alexander and his friends spent the next few months relaxing and being entertained by theater performances and sports competitions. But Hypatia caught a fever, became ill, and died. His death was a terrible shock to his lifelong friend and kind. For many weeks he was unable to think about anything else. Slowly, Alexander returned to his usual business. He planned to send ships and a long army around the coast of Arabia from Persia to Egypt. Other ships were going to check if the Caspian Sea was part of a northern ocean or joined the Black Sea, although its southern coast was part of the empire. No one seemed to know at that time that the Caspian Sea was actually a lake. But in Babylon, Alexander suddenly became ill. Possibly he had been poisoned by his officer. Probably he had cough at disease carried by insect while he was traveling and Babylon's waterways. He had a high fever and after a week he could not talk. On the 10th day, his court and army were given the incredible news: Alexander the Great was died. Chapter 10. After Alexander. Although Alexander's achievement had spread great customs for into Asia, the Greeks in Europe were pleased about his diet and decided to fight for their independence. To them, he was still a foreigner, but the Persians, who had lost an empire and hundreds of thousands of men because of Alexander, were very upset when they heard that he had died. King Darius' mother, who had become Alexander's prisoner after the Battle of Jesus, stopped eating when she heard the news, and was died herself 5 days later. Alexander had become the Persians' great king, whose rule followed the traditions of the past. He had been their friend.
After 9 months, she had no food, and she died proudly. Cassander then killed Roxanne and her son, who were visiting Greece, and made himself king of Macedonia. The Macedonians soon sold the lands that Alexander had conquered in India. They received 500 elephants for them. Many years later, these lands were reconquered by the Greek-speaking kings of Bactria, whose family had been started by one of Alexander Macedonia's governors. After years of fighting, 2 of Alexander's commanders controlled most of his empire. Ptolemy was king of Egypt, and Cleis king of the Asian Empire. The families of both men stayed in power until their lands were conquered by the Romans in the 1st century BC. All over Alexander's empire, Greek-style cities had been built. Their population were mostly European, and became perhaps more Greek in their habits as the years passed. In some areas, they preferred to marry their sister, niece or daughter, than to join their family with the foreigners that surrounded them. Each city had gymnasium and held sporting competitions and theater performance. In Afghanistan, building and works of art have been discovered which copied exactly the artistic styles of Greece. The works of Homer, Plato, and Aristotle were read and enjoyed in India, and even across the sea in Sri Lanka. The greatest of Alexander's new cities was Alexandria, the capital of Egypt.